So first section is why electric vehicles. Most people, when you talk to them about electric vehicles, tend to think that they're really not that clean because our electric grid isn't that clean. People think that we still have a ton of coal and oil on the grid and that therefore it doesn't really matter if you're driving a hybrid or an electric car. But that's really not true, and it's particularly not true in New England because each of the New England states has a renewable energy standard of some sort that's adding more and more renewable energy to the electric grid. So we like to point to data from the Union of Concerned Scientists. They have an EV emissions tool where you can put in your zip code, any zip code in the country, and even choose a specific car if you're thinking about one, and they will show you what the emissions are from charging that car specifically on your electric grid. So the average gas-powered car emits 381 grams of carbon dioxide emissions per mile driven. A plug-in hybrid, which is a vehicle that has a battery that you charge up by plugging the vehicle right into a wall outlet, but then also has a backup gas tank, will cut your transportation emissions in half from 381 to 181 grams of carbon dioxide emissions per mile driven. This is particularly important because transportation is now the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions nationally, but also specifically in Massachusetts. So if we really want to fight climate change, this is one sector we have to tackle, and electric vehicles are, in addition to public transportation and walking and biking, one of the really important tools in the toolbox. If you take it one step further and choose a battery electric vehicle, so this is a vehicle that has a big honkin' battery and is basically a fancy computer on wheels, so it does not have a backup gas tank of any type, you can cut your emissions by more than 3/4, which again is really incredible. Any other part of your life, if you wanted to make an impact that large, it would be a lot more work than just switching out one technology for another. And then one shameless plug, pun intended, is that Green Energy Consumers also has a renewable energy program where you can choose local renewable energy for your electricity. So if you opt up for the 100% option or for a similar option through a community's aggregation program, if some folks that aren't in Mendon and Upton are listening to this, you can bring your transportation emissions all the way down to 0. But again, the emissions of those plug-in hybrids and the battery electric vehicles will keep coming down over the coming years, both because newer models are more and more efficient, but also because our electric grid is getting cleaner and cleaner every year. A second big reason why we at Green Energy Consumers are big fans of electric cars are the public health benefits. And these are particularly striking right now in the middle of the COVID pandemic. So an electric vehicle, when it's driving just on electricity, has no tailpipe emissions. The emissions that I was referring to on the previous slide come from the electricity generators that are feeding power onto the grid. But again, even if you take that electricity generation into account, electric cars are far cleaner. The American Lung Association did a study in 2016 where they looked at the 10 states that at that time had electric vehicle targets or mandates in place to try and calculate the value of these public health benefits switching from gas-powered cars to electric cars. And what they found is that the climate and public health impacts of burning gasoline for transportation for just 1 year in just those 10 states amounted to $37 billion, which came out to $1.15 per gallon. So those are externalities that are caused by our reliance on fossil fuels for transportation that we're all paying for somewhere else, not at the pump. But the point here is that as we shift to electric cars, those costs and also the human suffering, first and foremost, will come down. Why? Why are they so much cleaner than gas-powered cars? And the main reason is efficiency. So gas-powered cars rely on the internal combustion engine. And that is a technology that we've been working on for over 100 years. And at this point, it's still only about 20% efficient. And what that means is that when you put a gallon of gasoline into your gas tank, only 20% of that gasoline is actually getting translated into motion. The remaining 80% is lost to friction and heat mostly. That's incredibly inefficient and a huge amount of waste. Electric vehicles, in contrast, are closer to 60, 70, 80% efficient, which means you can go further on less. So one way to look at that is to compare the miles per gallon and the miles per gallon electric of some popular cars. Miles per gallon electric is a measure of how far an electric car can drive on the same amount of energy that's stored in 1 gallon of gasoline, which is 33.7 kilowatt hours. And what it allows us to do is put electric cars and gas-powered cars on the same apples to apples scale and really get a good comparison. So on the right side of this graph, you can see some popular gas-powered cars and their miles per gallon. In the sort of blue color, you can see some traditional hybrids, which a lot of people still think of as the greenest option that's out there. They get somewhere between 40 and 50 miles per gallon. And then you can see from there to the left, the electric cars blow everybody else out of the water. The all-electric vehicles all have an equivalent of over 100 miles per gallon. And again, the newer and newer cars are just getting more and more efficient. So this is a large part of the reason why we see those greenhouse gas and public health benefits, but it's also part of the reason why we see a lot of consumer benefits. So the first reason why electric vehicles are a great choice for consumers today are lower fuel costs. This is even true right now where we have ridiculously low gas prices, and even true in New England where we have somewhat higher electricity prices than the rest of the country. There are kind of two ways of looking at this. On the left, I'm referring to some math that we do at Green Energy Consumers Alliance every quarter. We publish our methodology on our website, so you can plug in your own numbers as you'd like, but basically we make some assumptions about the efficiency of vehicles, electricity prices, current gas prices, and we do some math to figure out what the average driver in Massachusetts will save if they switch from an average gas-powered car to an electric vehicle. And when we last did this in July, that came out to about 3.6 cents per mile driven, which comes out to a little over $400 per year for a Massachusetts driver. We're pretty comfortable with that math because it compares well to the Union of Concerned Scientists estimate of $770 per year, which is a national estimate, and a more local estimate of $558 of savings for folks in the greater Boston area. It's a little bit lower because in July, gas prices were already really low. But one thing that's important to remember is that gas prices historically vary a lot, and electricity prices historically vary much, much less. So if you're driving a gas-powered car, your fuel costs one year might be double what they were the previous year. That's not going to happen with an electric car because electricity prices tend not to vary as much. On the right, I pulled a screenshot from a tool that the Federal Department of Energy has called the eGallon, where every day they post the average gasoline price for every state and then what they have called the electric e-gallon, which is their calculation for how much money a driver would have to spend on electricity to drive the same distance that a gallon of gasoline would get you. And normally when I pull a screenshot here, the difference is more on the order of dollars rather than tens of cents. Again, we have ridiculously low gas prices right now, but they won't stay that way forever. But even in this current climate, the electricity is even cheaper than the gasoline. So that is the sort of first reason why we are comfortable recommending electric cars to consumers. The second is maintenance savings. So an electric car, particularly a pure electric car, is a much simpler machine than a gas-powered car. There's fewer fluids, there's simply fewer moving parts that can rust or corrode or break and require replacement. And then there's advanced technologies that protect the parts that do move. So one classic example of this is regenerative braking. Basically, if you have this setting on your electric car, when you take your foot off of the accelerator, the car will recognize that you're trying to slow down and will slow you down faster than inertia or I guess friction would do alone, using some fancy magnets that they spin around the wheels. What that means is that you're actually putting energy back into the battery that would have otherwise been lost which means you're extending your driving range, but it also means that you're protecting your actual friction brake pads because you don't have to use them as frequently or as hard. So lots of people love electric cars for this reason, because really when you look at the owner's manual, for the first couple of years, the main thing that you have to do is rotate the tires every now and then. There's no fuel changes or any of that. And it's just one of the things that people love about their cars. So we've talked about fuel costs and we've talked about maintenance, and what that leaves are the upfront costs. And the good news is that there are several sets of incentives available to help bring the upfront costs of an electric car down. One thing that I like to say at this point is that a lot of people tend to think that electric vehicles are really luxury cars, because at the beginning of the market, that's kind of what they were. But now the average gas-powered car bought in this country costs around $37,000, and there are tons of electric cars that are available around that price point. So that's the first thing to mention. But again, you can bring that upfront cost down with these layers of incentives. So the first I'll start with is the federal tax credit. So if you purchase an electric vehicle, you qualify for a federal tax credit. It's up to $7,500, and I say up to because it depends first on the battery size of the car. So the larger batteries get a larger federal tax credit, but it also depends on your personal tax liability. If you don't owe $7,500 in federal taxes, the IRS will not write you a check for the difference between what you owe and what you qualify for with this EV tax credit. And unfortunately, you cannot carry the credit from one year to another. What that means is that this incentive is skewed towards the wealthy, folks that have a higher federal tax load. But if you decide to lease a vehicle instead of purchasing, the leasing agent, so basically the dealer's bank, gets that federal tax credit, and most of the time they roll those over into lower monthly payments, so you, the consumer, can still capture that value that way. One important thing you should know about the federal tax credit is that it was set up to jumpstart the electric vehicle industry. And the way it was set up was that once a manufacturer had sold 200,000 units in the United States, the federal tax credit would phase out in a delayed 6-month cycle. And so far, only 2 manufacturers have actually hit that limit and completed that phase out. So there are no more federal tax credits available for Tesla or General Motors, but all the other manufacturers still have a ways to go. So if you're thinking about anything that isn't a Tesla or a General Motors vehicle, there will be a federal tax credit available to you. In Massachusetts, we're lucky enough to have a state rebate for electric cars called the More EV rebate. You qualify for it whether you purchase or lease. And the way it works is once you've got the car and you've signed the paperwork, you fill out an application online, and they take a couple of weeks to process it, and then they send you a check in the mail. The program rules are that for pure battery electric cars, the final sales price has to be under $50,000 for you to qualify for this $2,500 state rebate. And for plug-in hybrids, the final sales price has to also be under $50,000, and it has to have at least 25 miles of electric range. So you can go either to the More EV website or our website at Green Energy Consumers to see what all the different cars qualify for. And then finally, there's a third layer of discount, which comes through the Drive Green program that we run at Green Energy Consumers Alliance. So the Drive Green program is basically a group buying program. We have built up a network of car dealers across Massachusetts and also Rhode Island who offer fixed discounts on a monthly basis for folks who come through our program. So if you sign up through the form on our website, you can choose a dealer that's in our network, get their discount, then you can go apply for the state rebate, get a check in the mail, and then when it comes time to do your taxes, you can fill out the form for the federal tax credit. And all of that together will pretty significantly bring down the upfront cost of any car that you're looking at. So I recognize that that was a lot of content, and to kind of tie it together, we have a somewhat simplified total cost of ownership analysis of the Toyota RAV4, because everybody seems to be buying Toyota RAV4s these days, and a comparable electric all-electric SUV, the Hyundai Kona EV, and then the Nissan Leaf Plus, which is a sedan. So I won't go through this in extreme detail, but basically we are just looking at the upfront costs, the energy costs over 5 years, and the maintenance costs over 5 years. We're not looking at things like dealer fees or depreciation or insurance or any of that, mostly because we wanted this to be relatively simple, but also because those things shouldn't vary too much between gas-powered cars and electric cars. So basically what we did is in the top row, we took the MSRP for the Toyota RAV4, which is $25,000, and compared it to the MSRP of the 2 electric cars. At first glance, the MSRP of those electric cars is higher than the Toyota RAV4, but when you take into account the available rebates and the federal tax credit, you come down to $26,000 and $28,000. Because we're in Massachusetts, that would actually come down even further because of the more EV rebate, down to $24,000 and $26,000. For energy costs, we're assuming that you're driving 15,000 miles per year. For the 2 electric cars, we're multiplying that by the efficiency for the electric car, which is a figure that comes from the EPA, and then multiplying that by 20 cents per kilowatt hour, which is roughly what most people pay for electricity in Massachusetts. Of course, if you've installed solar, and you're producing enough solar energy, you could turn that 20 cents per kilowatt hour to 0 cents per kilowatt hour, which is a combination that a lot of electric vehicle drivers take advantage of. But basically, the Leaf and the Kona are somewhere around $800 or $900 for the year. Toyota RAV4 is a little higher. We took the same 15,000 miles, divided by the miles per gallon, and then multiplied by a gas price. Which I recognize is higher than the gas price that we currently have, but more indicative of what gas prices generally are. For maintenance costs, we're taking the same 15,000 miles, and in the case of the 2 electric cars, multiplying by 6.6 cents per mile, which is a figure that comes from the AAA study that's linked at the bottom of the slide. We're using this AAA study because it's one of the few that compares gas-powered cars and electric cars maintenance costs apples to apples, but we do think that it is pretty conservative in the sense that it is overestimating the maintenance costs of an electric car, because when we've given this presentation to rooms full of electric vehicle owners, they've honestly kind of laughed at these figures, because most of them haven't seen any maintenance costs for the first couple of years and even after that. But for the sake of comparison, and because AAA is a source that a lot of people recognize, we'll keep it in for this analysis. The same study says that the maintenance costs for an SUV are around 9.6 cents per mile driven. And then for the bottom row, all we're doing is taking the upfront cost, adding 5 times the annual fuel costs and 5 times the annual maintenance costs to come to a total cost of ownership after five years of ownership. And there you can see that the electric cars win out. I mentioned on the previous slide that those maintenance costs seemed a little high to us. This is one of the reasons why. The city of New York has a massive fleet of vehicles that it operates, and they publish their maintenance savings every year, or their maintenance costs, I should say. And you can see on the right that when you break it out, the 2 all-electric vehicles have annual maintenance costs of $200 or almost $400, compared to $1,000 for the traditional hybrids and almost $2,000 for the gas-powered cars. So that is sort of one of the data points why we feel pretty comfortable saying that the AAA estimates are a little bit too high. And then last but not least, these cars are really fun to drive. And I say that as a person myself who doesn't really care about cars that much, but if you're driving an electric car, you notice the difference immediately. It is much quieter, it is much smoother, it accelerates very quickly. So when you put your foot on the accelerator, you are zooming and leaving everybody else behind. And as I'll talk about in a little bit in the second section, the experience of charging is really quite convenient for most folks, and particularly in COVID times when going to a gas station and touching a gas handle is kind of the last thing you want to be doing. It's quite nice to not have to do that. but we have tons of tons of owner testimonials on our website, and I know that several of the volunteers for Solarize Plus have EVs themselves, and I'm sure would be happy to talk to you about their experiences.